Before we begin, imagine a death so cruel, so symbolic, that it burned its way into the darkest pages of ancient history. A punishment not merely to end a life, but to make a statement. One final, golden lesson about greed. If stories like this fascinate you, if you're drawn to the shadows of the past, where power, blood, and betrayal intertwine, then subscribe to Dark Hours Archive. Here, history whispers in the dark, and sometimes it screams. Now, let us descend into the final hours of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and the man who died with molten gold pouring down his throat. Music deepens, growing colder. He was born into privilege, into the arms of a family already kissed by Roman politics. But Crassus wasn't satisfied with comfort. He wanted wealth, real wealth, not land, not titles, control. He made his fortune not on the battlefield, but in the ashes of others' despair. When Rome burned, Crassus bought. When the poor cried out, Crassus arrived with a cold smile and a deal in hand. It was after the Great Fire of 83 BC that he truly became a monster of opportunity. Owning his own fire brigade, he would watch flames consume a neighborhood before offering to buy the property at a fraction of its value. Then, and only then, would he order his men to put out the fire. The Romans whispered his name with a mix of admiration and disgust. Greed became his signature scent, but it wasn't enough. He craved more than coin. Power, glory, respect. The kind not bought but earned on the battlefield, draped in blood and laurel. Beat. Sounds of marching feet and distant battle horns. So Crassus allied himself with Julius Caesar and Pompey. Together, they formed the first triumvirate, a secretive triangle of power that puppeteered Rome behind its fading republic. But unlike Caesar, with his cunning, or Pompey, with his military genius, Crassus lacked the prestige of conquest. He needed his war, his victory, his immortality. And in 53 BC, he found it, in the barren, sun-bleached deserts of Parthia. Or so he thought. The wind howls, the tone shifts colder. The Parthian Empire, fierce and foreign, stood east of Rome, a place of silk and horse archers, gold and vengeance. Crassus, now in his 60s, led a massive force, 7 legions strong, into their lands, thirsty for glory. But glory would not come. It would bleed out slowly, grain by grain, across the desert. His army moved eastward, ill-prepared for the heat, for the silence, for the speed of their invisible enemy. The Parthians didn't meet them head-on. They danced around the Romans, swift, cruel horsemen loosing endless arrows from afar. Silent killers that never stopped moving. Crassus had never faced anything like it. Sound of galloping hooves, whistling arrows. At Carrhae, in modern-day Turkey, it happened. The Roman army, boxed in by heat and confusion, faced annihilation. The Parthians, led by the ruthless general Surena, struck with terrifying precision. They used a technique called the Parthian shot, firing arrows backwards at full gallop, never breaking stride. Their quivers seemed bottomless, their horses tireless. Roman shields, once symbols of strength, became tombstones. Crassus watched his men fall by the thousands. His son, Publius, young, brave, full of hope, led a cavalry unit in desperation, only to be surrounded, disarmed, and decapitated. His head would later be paraded before the Roman lines, mockery in the hands of barbarians. It shattered Crassus. His army was crumbling, his pride with it. His name, that name, was now a curse on the tongues of the dying. Lo, slow percussion begins, heartbeat tempo. He sought negotiations, peace, anything to stop the bleeding. But the Parthians had no intention of mercy. Surena offered a meeting, under a banner of truce. Crassus, desperate, agreed. It was a lie. Whispered, he should never have gone. Crassus and his remaining officers approached the Parthian camp. They were greeted with smiles, open arms, and poison words. The moment he dismounted, the betrayal began. A scuffle, a sword drawn, then chaos. Accounts vary. Some say he was seized and bound, others that he was killed resisting. But the result was always the same. The richest man in Rome, humiliated, betrayed, and butchered. But death was not the end. The Parthians weren't finished. They had something special planned. Low rumble fades into a distant hiss, like bubbling metal. To the Parthians, Crassus embodied Roman greed. He had come not for justice or faith, but for gold. He wanted their land, their wealth, their submission. And so, they gave him exactly what he wanted. Gold, in its purest, most unforgiving form. Sound of molten metal dripping slowly. They captured his corpse, or perhaps, some say, kept him alive just long enough. They pried open his mouth, held his head back, and poured molten gold down his throat. A cruel, theatrical execution. A warning. A message. This is what greed tastes like. And in that moment, Crassus became more than a man. He became a lesson. The molten gold hissed as it touched flesh. If he was still alive in that moment, if breath still lingered in his lungs, then the agony would have been unspeakable. Metal liquefied by fire, searing through the mouth, down the throat, destroying all that made a man recognizable. But the Parthians weren't after pain alone. They wanted performance. A lesson carved not in stone, but in memory. In fear. Crassus's golden death would echo far beyond that scorched plain. It would sail west, on the tongues of survivors and spies, until it arrived at the Roman Senate like a whisper wrapped in blood. Even in death, Crassus remained a symbol. Only now, he stood for ruin. Beat. Cold wind fades in. But that wasn't the end of the spectacle. Serena, brilliant, theatrical, cruel, ordered that Crassus's severed head be preserved and sent to King Oroda II, ruler of Parthia. It arrived during a performance of Euripides' The Bacchae in the royal court, an ancient tragedy about a king torn to pieces for defying the gods. Poetic. The actor playing Pentheus, the doomed king, was replaced mid-performance. Crassus's head was brought in as a prop, his real blood staining the stage, a grotesque merging of art and war. The audience roared. Laughter and applause. Not in honor, but in mockery. Rome's pride, shattered in a theater, far from the Senate's marble floors. Soft, mocking laughter echoes briefly. Crassus, who had once counted his riches in houses, slaves, and gold mines, was now reduced to a gruesome trophy. His ambition, once endless, now sealed in a grim pantomime. But let us step back, because this death, as horrifying as it was, didn't happen in a vacuum. Crassus was never merely a greedy man. He was a product of his time, a Rome bursting with ambition, hungry for conquest, addicted to wealth. As a young man, Crassus had watched Rome devour itself during the brutal civil wars between Marius and Sulla. He had aligned himself with Sulla, the winning side, and rode the wave of victory into immense power. But it was during these dark days that Crassus learned the true nature of Roman politics. It wasn't about ideals. It was about survival, influence, gold. And when Crassus returned to Rome, flush with plundered wealth, he didn't build temples or statues. He built a machine. He funded politicians, bankrolled campaigns, and filled the pockets of the Senate. He knew every player, every favor owed. Caesar himself owed him immense sums. But that wasn't enough. Crassus wanted the one thing that money alone couldn't buy: eternal glory. He tried to claim it during the slave revolt of Spartacus. Crassus crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency, lining the Appian Way with thousands of crucified rebels. It was monstrous, ruthless, and it worked. But Pompey, returning from Spain, claimed much of the credit. The Senate adored him. The people cheered for him. Crassus was left in the shadows again. Brief silence, then a slow pulse, heartbeat-like. He believed that marching on Parthia would finally tip the scales. It was to be his masterpiece. A swift campaign, rich in plunder, followed by parades and praise. He had the numbers, the resources, the will. But what he didn't have was vision. He underestimated the enemy, ignored warnings, refused the advice of experienced commanders. When scouts reported strange enemy movements, he dismissed them. When local guides urged caution, he accused them of cowardice. His pride had become blindfold and poison. And so, thousands died with him. The Roman response to Crassus's death was complex. Publicly, there was horror. Privately, some whispered of poetic justice. His enemies in the Senate smirked behind closed doors. Pompey, perhaps, felt the tremors of relief. One rival gone. One fewer name on Rome's ever-tightening power ladder. But Caesar mourned strategically. He used Crassus's death as leverage to reshape alliances, to shift power in his favor. And the Parthians? They had made their point. They had killed not just a general, but an idea. Rome's belief that gold and legions could conquer anything had melted, quite literally, on a battlefield of sand and silence. Desert wind howls, cut to faint metallic clink. Crassus's body was never recovered. No proper funeral, no monument, no ashes in a family tomb. His remains were scattered, perhaps burned, perhaps desecrated further. Lost in the great eastern void Rome could never quite tame. A rich man without a grave. A titan without a statue. And yet, even now, over 2,000 years later, his name lingers. Not for triumph, not for wisdom, but for how he died. He became a cautionary tale. A man who thought gold could buy eternity, but instead found that gold could end it. Molten, burning, unforgiving, beat, distant scream muffled by wind. But there's something deeper here, something ancient, a recurring truth in the dark corridors of human history. When men climb too high, when greed drives every breath, there is always a reckoning, always a price, always a moment when the very thing they crave becomes the weapon that destroys them. Crassus did not die alone. His gold died with him. And somewhere, perhaps buried beneath desert sands, lies the ghost of that melted treasure. Twisted, blackened, cursed, waiting. The story of Crassus doesn't end in the desert. Not really, because a death so symbolic, so grotesquely poetic, refuses to stay buried. It lingers. In politics, in ambition, in the fragile mass worn by every empire built on blood and gold. Rome tried to forget him. They tried to scrub the stain from their banners, to speak of Parthia in hushed tones, to refocus on victories and triumphs. But Crassus was everywhere, in the cautionary murmurs of generals, in the prayers of soldiers sent east, in the flickering torches of ambition gone wrong. He haunted them, and he haunted Caesar. Julius Caesar, the final surviving member of the triumvirate, would soon find himself alone at the top, a position as perilous as it was powerful. The death of Crassus unbalanced the delicate triangle of Roman power. Pompey, now wary of Caesar's rising popularity, turned against him. The collapse began. Civil war erupted like a fire in dry brush. And some historians whisper that it all began in Carrhae, with Crassus and his melted golden throat. His death created a vacuum, and history, as always, rushed to fill it with chaos. Beat. Sounds of marching legions faint in the background. Crassus had sought glory equal to that of Alexander. But Alexander had conquered the East. Crassus had been swallowed by it. The Parthians, proud of their victory, kept symbols of their triumph for decades. They displayed Roman standards, eagles ripped from fallen legions, as trophies. They passed stories of carry down through generations. They built pride from Roman shame. Rome would not reclaim those lost standards until Augustus, decades later, negotiated them back without spilling blood. Even then, the echoes of Crassus's failure clung to every thread. But there was one thread no negotiation could sever. The curse of gold. Music shifts to an unsettling hum, as if vibrating through bone. Let's pause, step away from the battlefield, from the maps and emperors, and examine something far older. The symbolism. Because pouring molten gold down someone's throat is more than execution. It's a ritual, a judgment. It was never about killing Crassus. They could have stabbed him, beheaded him, left his corpse for vultures. But no, they chose this. Why? Because the Parthians wanted to make a point that transcended politics. Crassus had come not as a liberator, but as a thief. He came to pillage temples, enslave cities, and feed Rome's endless hunger for treasure. His name, in their eyes, wasn't noble. It was filth smeared in wealth. He was greed incarnate, so they made his greed his coffin. Gold, his obsession, became molten fire, forced down his throat until he could no longer breathe, scream, or be. That's the thing about symbols. They outlast men. And in this case, the gold spoke louder than any sword ever could. Back in Rome, the whispers began. Whispers that would never leave. About how power corrupts. About how gold is never just gold. Not in politics, not in war. About how a man can have everything and still reach for more until the fire finds him. Crassus became a story mothers told their sons. A ghost in the corridors of ambition. A warning carved into the bones of Roman pride. And yet, Rome did not change. If anything, it grew darker. The lessons were there, but no one listened. Brief silence, just breath, then a low, cold voice. Because greed does not care about ghosts. It wasn't just Crassus who paid that day in Carry. His army, the proud legions of Rome, was left to rot in foreign soil. 20,000 Romans killed. 10,000 more captured, paraded through Parthia, and scattered across the empire like seeds of shame. Some were sold into slavery. Others were sent east, far beyond Parthian borders, possibly reaching as far as modern-day Afghanistan or even China. There are theories, whispers in the wind, that descendants of Roman soldiers built settlements deep in Asia, their armor rusted, their Latin forgotten. Imagine that. A Roman soldier, captured in a forgotten war, raising children beneath foreign stars, telling stories of a home he would never see again. All because one man wanted more gold. Sound, slow metallic dripping returns, echoing, haunting. The molten gold wasn't just Crassus's punishment. It was Rome's. A mirror, held up to its face, reflecting every crack and shadow. The same republic that cheered as slaves were crucified, that grew fat off conquered provinces, that valued wealth above justice. Crassus did not break Rome. He was Rome, in all its ambition, its hunger, its brilliance, and its rot. And in his final moment, mouth agape, throat burning, eyes wide with the horror of realization, he embodied something few men ever do. The exact price of unchecked greed. Long pause. Music fades into cold silence. But that's why his story lives on. Because history doesn't remember balance. It remembers extremes. And Crassus was the extreme. Too rich to fail. Too arrogant to survive. Too symbolic to be forgotten. History treats men like Crassus with a strange kind of reverence. Not because of what they built, but because of how they fell. Crassus never constructed great temples. He didn't pen philosophy or inspire art. He didn't uplift the poor or unite fractured nations. What he left behind was a crater, a gaping wound in Roman pride, filled with sand, blood, and molten gold. But that wound would fester, and from it, new horrors would grow. After Carry, Rome was shaken but not humbled. Instead of learning, it raged. The Senate, humiliated, demanded revenge. But Parthia was far, far away, across treacherous terrain, and the legions were broken. No one dared to follow Crassus's path, at least not yet. So the empire turned inward. And when Rome turns on itself, the blood runs colder. Pompey and Caesar, once uneasy allies, now stood as bitter rivals. Crassus had been the balancing weight between them. Without him, the scales tipped wildly. Alliances crumbled. Loyalties fractured. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and the Republic died. Sound. Heavy boot steps through a darkened hall. The irony is crushing. Crassus wanted to cement his place in Roman memory, to be honored as a war hero, as a god among mortals. Instead, he became the trigger, the spark that lit civil war. Rome burned. Senators fled. Armies clashed across plains and city walls. Blood flooded the streets of the eternal city. And through it all, the shadow of Crassus loomed, silent and golden. But even in death, he wasn't finished. Because the world remembered. The method of his execution, the molten gold, became more than punishment. It became legend. It inspired others. Dictators, warlords, tyrants. Centuries later, echoes of his fate reappeared. In the Mongol Empire, it said that rebels were punished with molten silver. In medieval Persia, traders were given the same golden drink Crassus had tasted. The act had transcended its origin. It was no longer just history. It was mythology, a ritual, the ultimate condemnation of greed. To desire wealth so deeply that it becomes the weapon that destroys you. Low choral voices swell softly, like mournful ghosts. But what kind of man was Crassus, really? Not the icon, not the corpse, the man. He was known to be reserved, calculating, almost cold. Where Caesar dazzled crowds and Pompey rode triumphant, Crassus worked in shadows, funding, manipulating, acquiring. His face rarely lit with joy, his hands always calculating. Yet there were moments, fleeting glimpses of something else. He was said to be devoted to his family. He adored his son, Publius. And when the boy's severed head was displayed before him at Carey, something shattered behind Crassus's eyes. Not pride, not ambition, but humanity. Perhaps that was his final punishment. Not the gold, not the shame, but being forced to watch his lineage, his legacy, beheaded before his eyes. To see everything he had built collapse in a single, blood-drenched moment. Beat, just wind and fire. Maybe that's the part we forget, that even monsters bleed. Still, the world did not mourn Crassus. There were no statues raised in his name, no temples carved with his victories. His memory faded into the darker margins of Roman history, overshadowed by Caesar's rise, by Pompey's fall, by Augustus's golden age. But among historians, among those who trace the fragile threads of empires, Crassus is not forgotten. Because every empire has its Crassus, the man who thinks himself untouchable, who mistakes fortune for fate, who believes the gods can be bought. Sound, metallic clang, as if gold coin hits stone and bounces once. And yet, there's a strange kind of justice in his ending. A man who spent his life exploiting fire, burning Rome only to buy its ashes, met his death in the very element he had weaponized. Fire. But this time, it wasn't in the form of burning homes or desperate sales. It was in the form of molten gold. Purified, concentrated, fatal. Music lowers into a slow, rhythmic hum, like a ritual heartbeat. We often ask, what drives a man like Crassus? What compels someone with everything to risk it all? The answer is simple. Fear. Not fear of death, but of obscurity. Crassus feared being forgotten. He feared dying rich, but irrelevant. Watching men like Caesar write their names into history, while he remained a banker with a sword. So he chased immortality. He thought glory would make him eternal. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. Today, his name lives on, not in honor, but in infamy. His tale told not to celebrate victory, but to warn of obsession, of the thin line between ambition and annihilation, of how even the richest man in the world can die with his mouth forced open, screaming against molten metal, with no gods listening. Silence. Then the faint hiss of molten gold once more. The death of Crassus was more than a military failure. It was a prophecy fulfilled. A man born into the very heart of Rome, who rose through cunning and calculation, not honor, not virtue, was finally undone by the very thing he worshipped, gold. Molten, searing, and absolute. And yet, his story was not burned away by time. It survived, because empires always remember their cautionary tales. Centuries passed. Rome fell. Its stones crumbled. Its emperors faded. Its language fractured. But Crassus remained, not in marble or myth, but in every retelling of greed punished, every story where wealth becomes a curse, every moment when power, unchecked, turns inward and devours its own. Even today, historians revisit Carey not merely as a defeat, but as a mirror, a dark reflection of human excess, of what happens when desire goes unchallenged, when ambition stops listening to reason. Crassus didn't just die. He transformed, from a man into a message, from a general into a grim reminder. Beat, soft hum of desert wind. It's easy to judge him now, to look back through the safe lens of history and mock his choices. But Crassus wasn't a villain in his own mind. He believed in Rome, in its destiny, in its right to conquer and civilize. He saw the East as treasure left unguarded. He believed his wealth entitled him to more land, more glory, more memory. And in that belief, he lost everything. His name, his legacy, his family, his flesh. Burned, destroyed, emptied, until all that remained was a mouthful of melted gold and a scream swallowed by fire. Music grows more ominous, like a low heartbeat beneath stone. Still, one must ask, what would you have done if you were Crassus? Would you have stopped, walked away, declined the call of history? Or would you, like so many before and after, risk it all for just a taste of eternity? That's the tragedy of men like Crassus. They see the world not as it is, but as something they must own. And the more they possess, the more desperate they become, until, at last, the world takes everything back. The gold they poured into his throat was no mere metal. It was prophecy liquefied, a ritual for the gods of balance, punishing one who had tilted the scales too far. And it leaves us with a question that haunts every empire, every ambition, every age. When is enough enough? Long pause. Music softens. But if you've come this far, if you've listened to the fire, the silence, the blood, the echoes of Carrie, then you understand. This story is not just about the past. It's a whisper to the present, a warning written in ash and gold. And there are more, many more, stories buried beneath the surface of time. Dark histories twisted by power, lust, pride, betrayal. Truths too disturbing for textbooks, too human to forget. And if you want to hear them, to feel them, to walk with ghosts and breathe in the dust of forgotten empires, then now is the time. Soft, ritual-like drum begins, slow and steady. Subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't just tell history. We resurrect it. We peel back the layers and let the shadows speak. Because the past is never dead. It's only sleeping, waiting, just like Crassus. And maybe, just maybe, listening.